Welcome to this fourth session of the Diwan of Sorbonne, Abu Dhabi and CEFAS. It's the fourth session, but it's only the second online session in a webinar format. And it is today my great pleasure to welcome here Professor David Wilmsen, who heads the Department of Arabic and Translation Studies at the American University of Sharjah in the United Arab Emirates. Professor Wilmsen is a distinguished Arabist, linguist, and dialectologist. He has previously taught linguistics and translation at the American University in Cairo, Georgetown University, and the American University of Beirut. His research interests encompass the history of the Arabic dialects, especially their ancient grammatical features that survive in the regional varieties of modern spoken Arabic, which will be one of the topics examined in today's conference. Professor Wilmsen has studied and published research on Maltese Arabic, Lebanese Arabic in its Kisserwan variety, focusing on morphosyntactic elements of these dialects. Gulf dialectology is certainly not as developed as this of Egypt or the Levant or Morocco, and we do not have a linguistic atlas of the region presenting its various isoglosses yet, but thanks to the pioneering efforts of such researchers as Bruce Ingham, Clive Halls, Marcel Kubershuk, Hamdi Qafisheh, Janet Watson, Nizar Habash, and many others, the modern dialects of the Arabian Peninsula and the Gulf region are now better known. The various dialects of the UAE, however, until recently might not have been so lucky as Kuwaiti, Omani, or Bahraini variants of Arabic. This seems, however, to be moving fast as a new grammar of Emirati authored by Mir al-Ka'bi, Dimitrios Telitheios, and Tommy Chung will be published by Routledge at the end of this month. Professor Wilmsen has had the wonderful opportunity to work on a precious corpus, that of the Sharjah Museum Authority, an ensemble of authentic recordings of old Sharjah port area dwellers that show what maybe, he will explain this to us, pre-coinization features that miraculously were documented via these oral testimonies. So we are delighted to welcome him at the Diwan and hear him now presenting singular features of Emirati dialects using the Sharjah Museum's Authority recordings as a data source.
Thank you very much. I'm going to work the miracle of electronics here and share my screen. And for some reason, when I share it, you can see it, but I can't. Oh no, I can. Now I can see it. That's great. You can all see this then? Good. All right, so here is the title of the talk, which Frederic already gave to us, so we won't stay here. How do I change? How do I change my screen? Oh, I see. There's this arrow down here. Good. Yeah, good. We're at it now. All right, so this is where we're situated, just so we all know. And you'll notice that I use that as a background on a lot of the slides, like the beginning one. Actually, I started this when giving talks about Emirati Arabic abroad and talking about Sharjah, because everybody knows where Dubai is, but nobody knows where Sharjah is, unfortunately. Well, people do, but some people don't, and so I always put this up to show everyone where we are. Now, as Frederic was saying, there has been very little work done with the dialects of the Emirates. One of the earliest works was by Timothy Johnstone in his famous book, Eastern Arabic Dialect Studies. And he actually mentions the feature that I came to the Emirates to study. I came to the Emirates for other reasons too, but one of the major reasons was I had developed an interest in what I was calling and will still call existential she, or she, but it does other things, which we'll see. So it's more than just an existential. And he mentions it in one place, and it appears also in at least once in his texts. I don't remember, maybe more than once. But there has not been even much talk about that, although it has been documented in a few dialects of the entire region. we also have Hamdi Qafisheh, who has written a short reference grammar of Gulf Arabic. Now it's really a short reference grammar of Abu Dhabi Arabic. Most of his work is done on the dialect was collected in Abu Dhabi, and he mentions that, although he claims to also speak for Bahrain and Kuwait as well, but it's really an Abu Dhabi dialect. So I would rather that he had called this a short reference grammar of Abu Dhabi Arabic or Emirati Arabic. That, as you can see, we have some work done in 1967, a complete reference grammar in 1979, although Qafisheh does not mention anything about grammatical or existential shay. And I think it may be, not in this particular case, but I've noticed in his work that there are things that I either disagree with or I would think there might be dialect differences. He was my first professor of Arabic, by the way, and the first Arabic of any kind I studied was in his book, what's it called? It's right over there. A basic course in Gulf Arabic. But now I know a lot more than I did then about Arabic, and sometimes I disagree with him. We also have this book it was a dissertation published by Rosina Fauzia Arrawi, who did this and then didn't do anything else with linguistics at all. She went to work for Ministry of Agriculture in Jerusalem. She's from Iraq to begin with. And now she's in fact a life coach of some sort. And I just happened to be looking at her webpage. She's got one if you want to go see her. And she's not doing anything about Arabic at all. She's more into spirituality and that sort of thing. But you notice that she did her work on the dialect of Abu Dhabi as well. There, now I have a laser pointer. Now, I'm happy to say that there's a younger generation of Arabists and dialectologists who are now paying attention to the dialects of the Gulf. One of them is Najla Kalash, who happens to be with us today. I invited her and I noticed that she's here. So I'm happy that she's here. And I was talking to another one, or emailing with another one a few days ago, who's working on her master's degree in Emirati Arabic. So I'm entirely pleased to find a new generation of Arabists who are actually interested in the dialects of the Gulf. And Najla is also working on things that are closer to home. You see that she has done something with the dialect, the Emirate of Dubai, but she's also now working on a text from Dubai and Ajman and Sharjah, which is really exciting. And I can't wait to see what she comes up with in that. All right, so what I'm calling this then is what Najla and I are working on. We have plans to work together, but we've been working individually so far. And I'm calling this Northern Emirati Arabic. And there are differences between the dialect of Abu Dhabi and the dialects of the Northern Emirates. They won't really concern us much today, but there are definitely differences, and there are things that I've noticed in my old textbook, which I've now taught out of a little bit also, that I've actually confirmed are not mistakes of my old professor, and they're not changes from 1979 until today, but they are in fact dialect differences between the dialect of Abu Dhabi and the dialects of the Northern Emirates. All right, so as I said, I first came to the Emirates for several reasons, but I had specifically in mind to research this particular grammatical feature of the dialects. And since working with the texts of the Sharjah Museums Authority, which I'll get into in just a minute, I also came across this thing that we'll see in a few minutes, but it's called oftentimes an infixed noon, and there's another name for it, but I can't remember what it is right now, which I had already known about before I got here, but I found evidence of it in the text that I was working with. And then something that I did not expect, which is the word aku, which is used in Iraqi dialect as an existential particle, which I'll explain in a few minutes. Now, what I intend to do actually is not address them in the order that I came to study them, but in the reverse order, because I'm still involved in studying echo. And I've just recently completed a study of the infixed noon, which I've sent off for, well, I presented it at the last IDA conferences, and it may be published eventually. And then I'll get into the existential shay, which I've spent years studying. And when I was preparing this talk, in fact, I thought, all right, we'll run through the echo and noon pretty quickly, which I did do. And then when I got to that, it took me days to be able to figure out what I was going to say about it, because there's so much to say. So it was the hardest part of the talk to prepare, but I think I've made it simple enough for people who aren't specialists in linguistics. All right, so let's have a look at where we are. Here's the United Arab Emirates in context, right in the Gulf. And the Gulf, of course, extends from Shatt al-Arab all the way to Hormuz. And then after that, we have the Gulf of Oman. So this is the Arabian Gulf. And when we talk about Gulf dialects, that's what we're talking about. Omani dialects are considered to be a different dialect grouping, although there are similarities between some of the dialects of the Emirates and some of the dialects of Bahrain. And in fact, the dialects that the dialects in these areas that are covered in green look to be the remnants of an old dialect area, which Clive Holes, who has probably done more about Gulf Arabic than anyone else living, and anyone else before him also. He calls this a broken chain of dialects. And he says they run around the coast from Bahrain all the way to Western Hadramaut, but he also dialects features of the same dialect that are Western Hadramaut would be right about here, right about there. But he documents these features all the way to here. And the ones I'm talking about have also been documented here. So this is a chain of dialects that runs from southern Yemen all the way through Bahrain and in the eastern provinces of Saudi Arabia. Now let's talk about the text a bit. I was extraordinarily fortunate to be involved with the Sharjah Museums Authority, and it all came about through a series of meetings with the authority, but eventually the Sharjah Museums Authority and my department at the American University in Sharjah hosted a conference together. And in the planning stages of that, one of the personnel of the Sharjah Museums Authority happened to tell me, while we were talking about what we would do with the conferees, and we would take them on field trips, and we would show them some of the museums. And she said, and one of my contacts said, "Oh, and we have a series of folk histories, and I could have someone talk about that." And I said, "I want to hear them." And so then I had to fill out a form to get access, and I was given access to the recordings and a set of transcriptions. Almost all of the recordings have been transcribed into Arabic. And I have copies of the transcriptions, but the recordings themselves are housed at the authority. For various reasons, they did not want them to leave the authority. So I spent a very pleasant year every Thursday going to the library at the main headquarters of the Sharjah Museums Authority and poring over these tapes and their transcripts and making notes to myself. And the occasion of this talk has given me a chance to go back over them again. Everything sort of came to a standstill right about the time of the pandemic, but I had pretty much gone through all the recordings by that time. But just going back through the transcriptions has been a wonderful idea. Now we have a picture of what's going on here. It's called the Al-Hisn Redisplay Project, and I'll tell you why it's called that in a minute. This is Old Town Sharjah that we're looking at a view of, and this actually is a photo from their website. And these are a couple more photos from their websites, and you can see that you get a feeling of what it might have been like to live in Old Town Sharjah. This, as you can see, is completely restored, and it's actually the backside of a hotel, or I think it's the backside of a hotel, but it still preserves some of the atmosphere of the old city. And it's called Al-Hassan Redisplay Project because the story goes that when the Sheikh Sultan bin Muhammad Al-Qasimi, who, mashallah alayh, has 2 doctorates, when he was away studying for his doctorate, apparently they began to take the old fort down. And when he came back, completed with his doctorate, and one of them is in history, so you know he's quite interested in the history of this area. He said, no, we cannot have that. We'll have to rebuild it. But in order to rebuild it, they had to find out things about where buildings had been placed, because it was an old town that had been neglected for a while. And the idea then was to talk to people who lived in Old Town Sharjah to find out where their houses were and where their neighbors were and what other things were happening. That one of the recordings, for instance, goes on for a long time discussing the wall and where each tower was on the walls. And you can see here we have the walls. This is an overview of Old Town Sharjah. We have the walls rebuilt. Some of them were there, but you know they were largely rebuilt. Here is Al-Hassan. So it's right outside what is now Old Town Sharjah, what they call the heart of Sharjah, or Gulf of Sharjah. And then we have buildings here that have been, some of them were standing and some of them have been reconstructed. This is an old market. And that hotel we saw is also as a part of this market. It's now open for business, in fact. And there's a series of markets that go through here. And then this is a Sharjah Museums Authority building. This is the Museum of Sharjah Museum of Art. And all of these buildings will be, maybe not that looks like it might be a mosque, but all of the buildings that you can see there, you can see a few of them in this picture. These buildings will all be torn down, except for that one, apparently. That one won't be. One of the Sharjah Museum's personnel was lamenting that to me, but I rather like this building. But it would be nice to have all these other buildings down. And I'm just reading in the paper recently that all the owners and the shop owners of apartments and shop owners of this area will be compensated handsomely. All right, now the recordings themselves involve 8 men, which constituted about 12.5 hours of recording. And there were 3 women involved who, for reasons of privacy, I have not heard their recordings, but we do have transcripts of them, which I have access to. And judging by the number of pages of transcripts, I estimate that there are about 8 hours of recording or interviews with the women as well. And this all of them together amount to 354 pages of transcriptions, 116 of which are the women. This is a huge and wonderful resource. And to find the thing is like finding gold for a dialectologist. And with that, I must give my thanks to the Sharjah Museums Authority in general, but also some specific individuals thereof. First of all, Manal Altaya, who was the Director General of the Sharjah Museums Authority. Fatma al-Muhairi was, at the time that the recordings or the oral histories were constructed, she was a researcher and actually the lead researcher of the project. And she did a thoroughly excellent job. She was very young at the time, still young, but she was even younger then. And it's just phenomenal to find such professional work by such a young researcher. And she's now the Director of Research at Sharjah Museums Authority, and she deserves it. Alia Borheima is the Education and Interpretation Manager at the Authority. And my thanks go to all of them and everyone else there, because they're all just wonderful people. And then my 2 graduate research assistants, Amna Saleh, who is a native of Sharjah, and Buthaina Hamoud, who is a native of the eastern provinces of Saudi Arabia. And they've helped me with the transcriptions. All right, so let's get into the language itself and the features of the language that I found interesting. Now, first of all, let me explain existentials, because when you hear existential, oftentimes you think of Jean-Paul Sartre or someone like that, and that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about when you say in English, there is such and such. And there are at least 6 different existential particles that are used in Arabic dialects. And there may be more, but at least the main dialects have these. So Iraqi Arabic and also Kuwaiti have aku. And here's an example of it. Aku banat bi madrasitkum. Or it's a question, are there girls in your school? Yemeni Arabic has several, but one of them is bi nashishil al-gild. Syrian Arabic and other Arabics also combined have this very famous one, fi. So here's one. This actually is a researcher who's at Sharjah University. Fi itta taht al-kursi. Moroccan Arabic has kayan wahad salugi lilbiya tamma. Tunisian Arabic has thamma and sometimes femma, and this becomes m in Maltese, by the way. And one of my students who's from Mauritania just the other day told me that in Mauritania, they also have femma. And Emirati Arabic, one of my students is also Emirati, and she was volunteering this. She's from Fujairah. Emirati Arabic has shay. It's also pronounced she and also pronounced shay and various ways as well. And this here, this particular phrase, shay internet wa free Wi-Fi, was given to me or said to me by one of the personnel from the Sharjah Museums Authority when we were talking about the kinds of resources that would be available to students at if they visit the Sharjah Museums, any of the Sharjah Museums, or their libraries even. And I was just thrilled when it was said to me. All right, so while I'm working through these recordings, or not, well, the recordings and the transcripts, I came across this particular phrase right here. This is the first one I came across. في أكي أوراق عندكم نسخ. And I thought, oh my goodness. Here's another existential particle that it should be, or has been said to be a feature of Kuwaiti and Iraqi Arabic, and Clive Hall says it's used somewhat in Bahrain as well. And then I started finding it also, this one here, أكي في المستشفيات راقدين أطفال. And he goes on to say, أطفال who have drunk Pepsi and cocoa. So he's blaming Pepsi and cocoa for their hospital visits, although I'm not sure that's what's happening, but we're interested in the language, not in the truth of what he's saying. Now this looks like it's probably feminine, and it could be with mustashfayat and awraq and even atfal. But we also find this. Aku biyuthum mawjood. Aku fi Amman hatina bil mathaf. Fil mathaf, sorry. But what I see is, when I first saw this, I thought, my goodness, it's an existential particle. But then looking at it, I found that it probably is more of what we call a presentative. And a presentative is not there is, but there it is. I'll give you a few more examples. Here we go. Aku maktub asamihum kulluhum taht. There it is. All their names are written below. وقال أكي عصاك. This is clearly a presentative. Here is your stick. You know, a walking stick or something like that. So then that made me reconsider whether, when I first came across these, whether what is being said is a presentative or an existential, and I'm not sure yet. And I'm going to be researching this more. This is something that I'm still researching. And I may be presenting this at the next IDA, results of my research at the next IDA meeting. So I don't want to go on with it more for that reason too, but there's not much more I can say about it anyway, except this. It has been attested in Yemen with singulars and plurals, akuwa, wa akunna, wa akiya, wa akinna. It's only attested in the masculine in Iraq and Kuwait, and as far as I know in Bahrain as well. The supposition then is that there are two different proposals for where this may be derived from. The earliest one is by Otto Jastrow, who says that it must come from the verb to be. But if we take the Yemeni constructions into account, it looks like it might actually be a demonstrative and presentative construction with the pronoun huwa, wahiyya, and etc., meaning there it is. And that's what, in fact, what Werner Diem, who's researched this, has said. And in favor of that hypothesis is that we find a cline leading from Yemen through the Emirates now and into Bahrain, and actually further on to Kuwait and Iraq. Now, Qafisheh has actually attested these. Haku, Hakhom, Haki. And my students also tell me that that exists. I'm looking for more of this, and I found a few more examples of this and a few more examples of Aku, Aki. In Bahrain, we have Aku with no feminine and no plurals, but we also have this Hakhu, Hakku, Hakku, Wahaki, Wahaki. So there is a feminine with the ha. And in Iraq only Aku, Iraq and Kuwait. So my thesis is going to be eventually, when I research this more, and we have my own findings now. As far as I know, nobody has ever attested this before, but they're well attested in the Sharjah Museum's transcriptions. And when you see the Arabic written, you're seeing something that I've just lifted from the transcription and put it onto the page, onto the slide, because the transcriptions are fortunately transcribed into Microsoft Word. All right, let's look at the infixed noon. Let me explain first what's happening here. In Arabic dialects throughout the entire Arabic world and extending beyond what we would call the Arabophone world into as far as the Arabic dialects of Khorasan and some of the Arabic dialects in Chad and Nigeria and Lower Sudan, there are various ways of affixing an object pronoun to the participle. So in Cairene Arabic, if you wanted, I'm going to do this, give in the examples feminine forms because they show a little bit easier that way. Shayfa, meaning I've seen him. And in Levantine Arabic and other Arabics, you get shayfitu, meaning I've seen him, if you're a woman saying this, or if you're saying it about a woman, or if the person involved is a woman. In Omani, in Emirati, in Yemeni Arabic, we get shayfatinna. And it's only in this part of the Arabophone world where we find that. And we find examples of that. And this is not something that I myself have discovered by myself. The other people have talked about it. Holes has a complete article about it, in 2011. He discusses it in some detail in his 2016 work and in somewhat less detail in his 2018 work. Arawi mentions it, but doesn't do much with it. Qafisheh mentions it, and I'll show you what he says about it in a minute, for the UAE. Reinhardt in 1894 has mentioned it, but without doing much about it. And Holes has mentioned it for Oman also in his 2016 work. And Landberg has documented it in Yemeni Arabic. And Jonathan Owens has an entire article about it, not for any particular dialect of Arabic, but sort of an overarching view of it. This is what Qafisheh says. There are two forms of active participle plus suffix pronoun, one without and the other with the ending in before the suffix pronoun. And that turns out to be important for us. Holes has this to say about it, and you could say this about Emirati Arabic in general. Unfortunately, we still have no comprehensive dialectological study of the Emirates. Or he says, oops, the situation in the UAE is currently unclear. Now he's talking about the infix noon itself, but that could be true of a lot of other things about the Emirati dialects. And I've actually corresponded with him about this particular feature while I was studying it. And it turns out that what he's found about and everyone else has found about the infix noon in other dialects also applies in the Emirates, but there's one difference that I'll point out in a minute. So here's the first one I found. Someone talking to Fatma al-Mahiri, and he says, شايفنا طال عمرك, sorry, في سنة 52. So there it is right there, شايفنا. Meaning I saw it, they're talking about a book that one of the Qawasim had written. It was an old book, so it wasn't Sheikh Dr. Sultan bin Muhammad al-Qasimi, one of his ancestors. This is from one of the women, so I haven't heard her say it, but I found it in the transcriptions. Yom عندي شيء مساوتنا. When I have something that I made it, and then she says, I send it off. Now this is something that I've heard. This is, so I don't have the Arabic written here, just the transliteration. Al-walda, and this is something that no one has noticed before. The noon assimilates to the lam if there is a dative lam afterwards. So al-walda musawatillak riyug. Mother's made breakfast for you. Now, when we get to Abu Dhabi, we find that you might have it without, as Qafisheh says, محتاجج, مكتبي محتاجج. My office needs you. I should say about Abu Dhabi, I only get to Abu Dhabi very rarely, and when I do, I go to visit my brother-in-law, so I don't, who's Jordanian, so I don't actually get to hear a lot of Abu Dhabi dialect, except that I have the radio on when I'm driving there and when I drive back. So this is actually, this particular example is taken from a musalsal that is on Netflix. It's called in English Justice, and in Arabic it's called Gulf of Aden. So if you want to go hear it, you can hear it. It's in one of the early episodes. I think there are only 8 episodes. And it's about a lawyer whose daughter graduates and becomes a lawyer, and he wants her to work in his office. So that's what was going on there. She's having trouble, and she says, or her mother says to her father, he محتاجينك هالوقت أكثر من قبل. So we find that it may appear in Abu Dhabi, just as Qafisheh says. And she says to her father the same thing. أنا محتاجتلك في الوقت أكثر من أي وقت ثاني. All right, so, but what I have found is this in my observations, the observations extraneous to the Sharjah Museum's transcriptions, is that you never hear it in the Northern Arabic, Northern Emirati Arabic without the infix noon. But you do find it in the Abu Dhabi dialect with or without the infix noon, just as Qafisheh had said. Also, no one has ever noticed this, that there is assimilation. So the 2 orange ones are things that I have actually found. And I say you never hear it, but I have heard while in the Northern Arabic, Northern Emirates, on I think 2 occasions, someone using it without the infix noon. But the thing was, I couldn't tell where those people were from, and they may not have been native Northern Emirati speakers. So I'm going to say that almost invariably in Northern Emirati Arabic, the infix noon is there between the active participle and its object. Now, Holes in his 2018 work has actually charted these, and you'll see where they have been documented or where he has documented them. These are all his own documentation. These are where other people have documented them. And you'll see that what that does is that fits exactly with this broken chain of dialects that Holes talks about. All right, let's get on to existential shay, and I think that we're going to actually have enough time for some discussion as well. I'll remind you what existential predication is. We don't need to go through it again, except that now we have this in red, because this is what we're going to look at. And this is thoroughly unusual, because all of these others, we might say that we can guess where they come from, and they all come from Arabic. There's a bit of a discussion about whether it's aku comes from hakhuwa or whether it comes from yakun, but otherwise we can say that all of these are quite familiar, and we can guess at how they developed existential particles. Bi and fi, for instance, almost surely come from bihi wa fihi, in it. And kain is obviously kain, meaning being. The Tunisian thamma, we know this one. This exists in written Arabic as well. And it comes from a demonstrative meaning there. There's a bit of debate about this amongst Semiticists, but there is clear attestation of a thamma meaning there in Yemeni Arabic in the work of Peter Bainstedt. There's a question about shay. Where could this come from? And the default has always seemed to be, although there has not been much discussion of existential shay amongst Arabic dialectologists until I came along. And a lot of people still disagree with me, but I think I may have found reasons to, which we'll talk about at the end of the talk, reasons to show that this must be where it comes from, but it may not be the word for thing, although there is certainly a word for thing of the same shape in many Arabic dialects, although not all, and in Fusha as well. So there should be a slide here where let me go back. If it goes back, yeah, there it is. Yes, I am going to argue that that aku comes from hakhuwa, so that means the only thing we don't know where it comes from is shay, and we may have found that out too. Now there are attestations of shay also in the same works, almost the same works as we've seen before. Holz has discussed it to a great degree in his 2016 work, and he discusses a little bit in 2018. Johnstone mentions it, as I say, once. And maybe in his text too, there's one example of it at least. Reinhardt gives some examples of it. Holz, when he's talking about the whole bundle of features in that broken chain of dialects, he discusses shay and among many other things. And there is now another young researcher, I'm happy to say, who is going back and examining Reinhardt's attestations of shay, and she's doing research field work, or she's done field work in the same areas of dialect areas that Reinhardt covered, although the value there is that she's actually been to the dialect areas. Reinhardt had a speaker from that area whom he was interviewing while in Germany, I believe. And Landberg has a few citations of it as well. But there has never been much of an examination of what goes on with it. So now we're going to do it. So it means there is, actually. And here's a bit from the transcriptions. Awwal ma shay maqahi, shay maylis. Awwal in this dialect, it can refer to the old days. So that's how I've translated it. In the old days, there were no coffee houses. There was a majlis. I was looking up to see if majlis actually exists in English, and I'm almost sure it does, but I couldn't find it defined in a dictionary. But it means a meeting room. Nowadays, almost every house has one. So it's a place where you go and sit. Apparently, in Old Town Sharjah, there was one, and it probably was in the house of the sheikh. Notice the negation. It's regular negation, ma-shay or ma-shi. There are various ways it's pronounced. This has traveled all the way to Morocco, and it's not an existential in Moroccan Arabic. It's an attributive negator, ma-shi, henna. He's not here, for instance. All right, here's another example that I wanted to show you because we have this also. Hay, fi, or hay, fi, like in ghanam, mashay, or mashi. Now what this shows is that shay is not the only existential particle that we find in the Emirates. And in fact, there has been some talk by Holz and other people who've examined it a bit, that she or shay, and its reflexes, is probably the older form, and it's passing out of use because fi is being used now. And that may be because of the influx of speakers of Egyptian Arabic and Levantine Arabic who have come in large numbers since in the pre-oil days. But we can't be quite sure about that because fi does exist in Yemeni Arabic as well. as an existential. But in any case, it seems to be, the she or she seems to be reducing it, facing less reduced usage in the modern era. And I actually had a conversation with a student who was actually put in touch with me by the Sharjah Museums Authority, who told me that his grandfather never said fi as an existential and always said she. But my students also and my research assistants have, and I also was noticing this well before I even started working with the Sharjah Museum Authority transcriptions, that she is negated more often than it is used in the affirmative. And my students have told me that. And the Sharjah Museum oral histories actually confirmed that, because we see that she is used as an affirmative existential, actually only 6 times in the entire transcriptions. That's about 15% of all usages. And fi is used 34 times, or 85% of usages. Mashe, on the other hand, is used 72% of the time. So to negate an existential predication, you're much more often to find it being used mashe instead of mafi, which is only 32 times in number, or 26% of the usages. And that in itself seems to indicate that there is a language change in process. All right, but this is actually used for other reasons as well. Not just in this dialect, but in other, variously across other Arabic dialects throughout the Arabophone world. And one of them, there's always some confusion about what we should call it. And I used to call it a partitive after Cowell's definition of it in Syrian Arabic. And Harrell, when he talks about it in Moroccan Arabic, calls it an indefinite article. But you find it here in this part of the world as well, although not nearly as often as you find it in other dialects as well. So here we have it, يقولون كانوا شي مواطنين في مواطنين ومواطنات. So here it does not mean there are countrymen, it means they were some country, some, you know, there some unspecified group of countrymen, مواطنين. And it's used like that in other dialects as well. And the abbreviation here, QTV, means quantitative. It's also used in the, probably from the same conceptualization to mean either or. And this has been documented in Yemeni Arabic by Janet Watson. And it's been documented by me in Egyptian Arabic, and it's been documented without its being identified as such in Syrian Arabic, but you get it here too. Gawarib, Bugarabain. Oops, sorry about that. Shibu Markabain. Shibu Markab. So, boats. He's the owner of boats. Either the owner of 2 boats or the owner of a boat. And here, pas means possessive. And this is Abu in its possessive sense, not the father of. Okay, and it's also used to pose what's called a polar question. In other words, a yes-no question. She isma sug sagar is its name, and I say that this probably is conceived to mean is it or is it that. So we might gloss this as, is it that its name is sug sagar? And the answer was yes. Oh, it was hey, actually. Let me close this window. There's a construction site outside. I thought they'd all left. Notice that here the same question comes at the end of the utterance, and this is the way it usually appears in most dialects. It appears a lot in Lebanese dialects, Levantine dialects in general. There's a question mark she that occurs at the end of the sentence. So here's another one. وَتِتْذَكَّرْ أَسَامِي الْخُيُولِ شِي. And it's like, I think that here it means something like, you do not remember the name of the horses, is it? Is it that you do not? Now, the reason I'm showing this map again is that when we have it at the beginning of the sentence or the end of the sentence, Holes has documented it at the beginning and the end of sentences in Omani Arabic, at the beginning and end of questions in Omani Arabic, and in Yemeni Arabic, as far as any of the documentation I've seen, it's always at the beginning of the question. So we have there another climb that goes from here to here. And it's sometimes used in Bahrain as well. Holtz documents it there, but it's always at the end of the question. So there's a climb, as I say, from here to there. Beginning of the sentence, beginning and end of the sentence, end of the sentence, or end of the question. Let's go on. Oops, I missed something. Missed a slide. Here we go. Now, what I want to talk about now is, it turns out from some work that I've done recently, I happen to have been in Dhofar at the beginning of the year, right before the pandemic came. And I was aware that modern South Arabian languages have a similar particle that is pronounced like this, she, not she, but very close. It's called a lateral fricative, or lateral sibilant, sorry. And there have been documentations of even the same particle as pronounced as she, and there's been she and a few others. But I happen to be in Dhofar investigating Mehri, which is the largest of the modern South Arabian languages. And Mehri, for the most part, seems to have she. And it turns out that all of the features of this, what I now am calling a grammatical she, multifunctional grammatical she and she, works in exactly the same way. And there is some speculation that South Arabian languages were spoken in this entire area in the pre-Islamic era. Now that doesn't necessarily mean modern South Arabian languages, although this same researcher, Yule, who's an archaeologist, thinks that perhaps modern South Arabian languages shouldn't be called that at all because they may be older than Old South Arabian. What that gives us is a chance of proximity between Arabic speakers and modern South Arabian speakers in the pre-Islamic era. And let us look how it works in Mehri. These are some examples of a paper that I've just submitted to Journal of Semitic Studies. And these come from work that I was doing in January. All right, so look, we find an existential she actually, in Mehri. We also have the quantitative in both ways. She kem, she makon al shikar barki. Do you have some place I might hide in? This actually is from Watson's latest textbook about Mehri. You see it in the either or that I showed you in Arabic. Yaqdima maqdod, she tawal or she qsar. They cut the meat into many strips, either long or short. And it also occurs as a polar interrogative, although in the data that I have, it's not very often, but it does appear. Ahawlaki tos awla nasromasi, she. Now, what I am trying to say is that what I think after examining this for a while is that this particular grammatical particle in Arabic is probably borrowed from South Arabian languages, even up to perhaps the meaning of the word thing, because it does exist in Mehri and other South Arabian languages to mean thing as well. Although in the data that I was collecting, it's used far more often in the other, well, depending on how you count them, but at least as often in the other grammatical functions, mostly existential, as it's used to mean thing. And sometimes when it's used to mean thing, it seems like it's probably a borrowing from Arabic, back into Mehri. So the question then becomes, how did this grammatical she that is used in all kinds of other ways, except as an existential in other dialects of Arabic, how did that happen? And Holz gives us the answer to that, and I tend to agree with him. that when you look at these bundle of dialects, that bundle of features that all of these dialects in the map that I've showed you before, you find them in this bundle of dialects only, or scattered variously throughout the Arabic world, the Arabophone world. And he says that these must have come from a single source, which would have been Southern Arabia, and spread by the later diaspora, which begins around 640 AD. So we have some time for discussion. And again, I must give my thanks to the Sharjah Museums Authority, because they have made this priceless resource available to me and to other, I'm sure other dialectologists could work with it as well, just by filling out a research request form. And here are the references. There are a lot of them, sorry, so it's a bit crowded, but the talk is being recorded, so you can always refer back to these later. And I thank you very much for your patience, and I'm thrilled that you're all interested in the dialects of the Emirates, and let's hope for much better things from the younger researchers who are on a lifetime of discovery.
Thank you very much, David. This was extremely interesting. It was really thought-provoking, especially this last thought-provoking hypothesis about a South Arabian origin of not only existential she, but also all those other grammatical functions that you mentioned. I will use my privilege as the host for this conference to begin with questions. And meanwhile, of course, everybody here can prepare questions. I will give you, I will open your mics a little later. My first question is not a question in dialectology at all. It's about those recordings of the Sharjah Museum. Are they used for oral history research as well? Are you a team working on those recordings, some of you being dialectologists? Well, you are the Arabist and dialectologist working on those recordings. Are they also going to be maybe later published? Is there any plan for a publishing of all those recordings to be used by historians in terms of oral history? And why is there such a problem with actually giving full access and possibility of copying the audio have they been digitalized? Is there any plan to have it published? Because this would also be a tremendous resource on the one hand for historians and on the other hand for linguists and dialectologists.
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because I had intended to say, and I forgot to say, that the recordings were all conducted between 2008 and 2010. And they are in digital format. When I was listening to them, they were on a computer that's housed in the library at the Sharjah Museums Authority offices. And so they're not tape recorders. I don't know how they were recorded to begin with, but they are also very high quality. Well, there's one where there's a lot of construction noise going on, because they're going around while the talk is being recorded, or the interview is being recorded. They're going around the construction site of Hessen, but then they decide that they better move to a quieter place. And at the time, I really don't think that there was any dialectologist who was working with them. It was simply oral historians with training in how to conduct research, or how to conduct these interviews. And they, I must say, they did just a phenomenal job of everything. The way they conducted the interviews were thoroughly professional. For a dialectologist to have access to that native speakers of the dialect in question conducted, without there being any dialectologist anywhere around, is a wonderful thing, because that completely takes out the observer's paradox, which is you want to observe people using their natural language, but as soon as you start observing them, they may change their natural language. So that is just a wonderful resource. Also, the transcription itself is, first of all, I was delighted to find that it was transcribed, because when I first heard of them, I thought, okay, so I've got a large job in front of me to transcribe these recordings. But then when I met with Fatma the first day, she just brought them out. And, well, she gave me the files. She didn't bring them out physically. She said, here are the transcripts. And I was delighted. And I was also delighted to find that when the researchers were transcribing it, they were not affected by their knowledge of Fusha, which is always a danger. You tend to want to correct what's being said for the spelling. And you may have noted, those of you who can read Arabic, and everyone I saw, except perhaps G, so everyone I saw joining at the beginning can read Arabic, and you could see that there are some non-conventional spellings, but that for a dialectologist, that's a good thing, because you can see that, like now when I don't have access to the recordings, I can see, when I look at the transcriptions, I can see the way the things are supposed to be pronounced, usually. Sometimes with shay, you can't, because it can be pronounced several different ways. Like with the way the women were pronouncing shay, I don't know how they were pronouncing it. It's just there written in Arabic, not in transliteration. And what was the other part you asked? Oh,
well, is it going to be published? Would it be published either in a written form, or are the recordings themselves going ever to be published? Because this would be so. First of all, I don't know why specifically they didn't want the recordings to leave the offices of the Sharjah Museums Authority, but I didn't dispute that. I think partly it has to do with preserving the privacy of the individuals involved, many of whom have already died. And in fact, in order for me to get access to the recordings and the transcriptions, the families had to agree as well. And they all did agree, although the families of the women didn't want me listening to their voices, and I don't mind that. I have enough understanding of the way Arab society works that I didn't even raise my eyebrows at it. But it did occur to me when preparing for the talk, and as I told you before people started joining, I had all the transcriptions, each one by one, and in preparing for the talk, I had taken them all and made them into one document. And then I thought, well, my goodness, 354 pages, that is actually book size, and these things actually ought to be published. So I probably will approach the Sharjah Museums Authority and ask if they can be published. Obviously, they'd have to be edited, so the names would be taken off, because the names are there. It can be anonymized. Yeah.
Yes, it can be, yes.
Excellent. Okay, I had two technical questions, and then it's finished on my.
Okay.
First, about shy, when it is used as an existential, what happens when you ask, is there a thing? Meaning, would you say shay, or does it trigger the use of fi if the existence is the existence of a thing?
You actually see both. And I do have I think there is even in the transcripts themselves one place where there's shay, but I've certainly collected it elsewhere, and also ma shay. Mm-hmm. Okay. There is no such thing. And I've also seen ma fi shay and fi shay. You see it all.
Okay. Last technical question, and then yes. I will give a chance for other people actually to react to your conference. It's about negation. Did you notice any sort? Well, actually, I still have another one after that, maybe later.
Maybe we should let other people.
Do you notice any alternance between mub and hab? And is this something you would be interested in investigating? And I'm kind of, I don't understand where hab as a negation comes from. Could this also, and I'm asking a question to you and other people working on South Arabian languages, could hab as a negation also be some sort of a remnant of South Arabian?
Actually, I don't think it is, and I have done some research with that. There is no instance of hab or hub in the Sharjah Museum Authority's
Okay.
tapes, but I was making note of the way mub was pronounced, because sometimes it's pronounced mub and sometimes it's pronounced mab.
Oh, okay.
But I don't think that comes from modern South Arabian. I think it's very clear where hub comes from. It comes from mahubi.
Okay.
And I have collected other instances of hub, which I should also point out is used from the Yemen through the Emirates.
Okay.
I don't think it goes into Bahrain. I'd have to ask Clive Holes about that. But there's even a Yemeni song that has, I can't remember what it is now, something like hub تقول هو عادي بس حب عادي, I think is the way the lyric of the song goes. It's a Yemeni song.
Okay, very interesting. Delphine Armand had a question, so Delphine, you can switch on your mic.
Yes, hi, and thank you for the talk. I was wondering, just, I don't know if it has a link or what, but as the aquí, can it
Yes.
have a link with the Spanish and the Portuguese aquí, which means here? Do you know, or not at all?
I hadn't thought of that. I had not thought of that.
No, because there is a lot of words in
Yeah.
Spanish, and also in Arabic, Portugal, it's come from Diwan and everything. So maybe there is a link or not.
Well, now I'm going to look into that, because the first thing you'd want to do is see how is that said in the other Romance languages, and if it's not said that way in other Romance languages, then the first thing thank you for telling me that. Then the first thing you think is perhaps it did come from Arabic.
Yeah.
And we know that if you know the history of Al-Andalus, there were people that identified themselves as Yemenites in Al-Andalus.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
You're very welcome, and thank you for the question. That's interesting. That gives me another entire aspect of the research to look into.
Yeah.
Hi, David.
Jishim, I don't know what's the complete name. Maybe Jishim, you can speak now.
Thank you. I have a question, David. Thanks for the interesting talk. I have a little bit of like kind of preliminary syntactic analysis of shay, you say. I was wondering whether that shay could be something like free choice item, similar to English any. So it should occur in some licensing environment, but the context can be free. Could it be positive, negative, even actually, the question. So maybe, I don't know how to, drive its use of existential, the context, but maybe would it be, that could be the origin. So that's why there's some relation, is a prenominal element,
That may very well be. Now, of course, I'm giving an abbreviated presentation of all the data that I have, but I have written about this. I'm one of the few people who've actually written about this at length, maybe the only one. And I do have data where it can be, where it could be understood as, in fact, as an indefinite article. It could be understood as any, it could be understood as some, and other things like that, in both Mahri and in Arabic. Now, you're asking about the origin then, and the origin is still a bit unclear. I'm fairly sure now that it's probably a borrowing from South Arabian, but that doesn't tell us how it began in modern South Arabian. It only tells us that it came into Arabic from modern South Arabian. And that will require further work, which I may not be capable of, but there are a lot of people now, fortunately, also working in modern South Arabian languages. Lots. It's heartening to see that, and also impressive. So maybe they can answer the rest of that question for you.
But does lateral she, or I cannot pronounce it, but does it mean thing as well in South Arabian languages?
Oh yes. I didn't mention thing because it's so well known in Arabic that it's almost the default. In fact, it is the default explanation of anything that has to do with a grammar with a sheen in it.
Okay. Since I do not see yet any other questions, I will ask, I will take this chance to ask another one. At some point you mentioned that this particular feature, it was about the infix in. It was kind of compulsory. You always heard it in the North Emirates, but it was kind of facultative. I'm losing my English. The country
optional.
Optional, exactly.
Yes.
It was kind of optional in the South Emirates or in Abu Dhabi Emirate. Okay, my question is it even possible to draw an isoglossic map of the Emirates, knowing, or is the criteria really geographic in a country where the way people speak has not only to do with where they were born and where they live, but also what is their tribal origin, what is their origin in UAE? Are they sons and daughters of Badu who were actually dwellers of this zone of the Arabian Peninsula? Do they come, do their ancestors come from what is nowadays known as Saudi Arabia, or from Oman, or from other regions? So is it even possible to speak in terms of isoglosses in this country?
All right. The reason why you could speak in terms of geographic location of isoglosses has to do with the settlement patterns of the tribes in various parts of the Emirates. And when I first came to the Emirates, I heard people telling me that, oh, in fact, one of my students, my student from Fujairah just the other day said, we've got an entirely different dialect in Fujairah, she said. And she mentioned the name of some place. She said, I don't even understand those people who from that area. And that does have to do with probably, we would have, this really needs more study, but we'd have to, but it probably has to do with who the tribes were who were settling in those areas, in the areas where these dialects are now spoken. So yes, you could do a geographic map of isoglosses. And in fact, one of the things I hope to do is dialect map of at least the Northern Emirates. I don't know if I'm going to get to the Southern Emirates, or the Southern Emirate, if you'll excuse me. Now, the other thing is, yes, it does very much have to do with, or it seems clear that it has to do with the settlement patterns of people who were here when the Bedu migrated in from Nejd, or maybe even closer than Nejd. Clive Holes speaks of this a lot. He's spoken of it over and over again and written about it over and over again. And the reason why we have this broken chain that he calls it, and I'm perfectly content to call it that, is that there probably was in the earlier era, earlier meaning before Islam, a contiguous dialect area of what might be called archaic Arabic dialects all along the coast of Yemen and Oman. And Holes actually says in the coasts and the valleys of Oman and in the Emirates and all the way up to Bahrain. And in fact, he said, Holes himself, Holes has been saying this more than anybody else. And I'm perfectly happy to be corroborating what he says. He says that in Bahrain, the tribal memories are such that they are people who have eventually, who did come from Yemen. And even some of the place names of the village names are Yemeni names, or at least tribal names from the Yemen. So I think I answered the question.
Thank you very much. Najla Kalash has a question for you now.
Good. Hello,
yes.
Najla.
Hello, David. How are you? Very nice
happy
to
to
see
hear from
you. Yes, me too. And thank you also, Professor Lagrange. I have a question. It was a very interesting talk, especially for me that I'm working on the texts from young Emirati women. I would like to ask you, which is the most common negative particle that you find in the transcriptions used before a noun or adjective?
It's usually meb or mob.
Mub or mub. Okay. Anything
What do you
else?
find? Well, sometimes mad.
I find almost everything because, yeah, these youngers, their age is about 20, 25 years old, talk with a very kind of mixed variety. So they use also mish, mub,
All right.
ma, everything.
Yes.
And also sometimes they mix with English. So it would be very, very interesting for me just to compare the older variety with the newest one. So thank you very much.
I'm sure
Yeah.
I've looked through the transcriptions before to find mish, but
Yeah.
I didn't think of that when I was preparing for the talk, but I will do that. But I'm positive that it's mostly mub or meb. But mish is used, and it seems to be used a lot more. And again, I've had corroboration from native speakers of Emirati dialects who say that it wasn't used that way before, that it's come from outside.
Okay, yes. Okay, thank you very much.
Sure, certainly.
Thank you very much.
That's a good question.
Thanks.
Thank you, everybody. Is there a last question for Professor Wilmsen? Then, if it is not the case, Delphine Armand is thanking you. So thank you very much, David, for
my pleasure. I had a great deal.
Talk. And we certainly want to see something coming out of print soon. We would really love to see those recordings, even if only the transcription in Arabic, printed in Arabic soon. Excuse me, there's Ahmed is sending something. Maybe Ahmed wants to, I'm giving him the mic. Ahmed, do you want to pose your question? You can speak now.
Oh, it says his mic's not working.
Or your mic is not working. So
yeah, but
immigration started from Yemen to various places in all directions in pre-Islamic Arabia, since the Kashkasha is mainly, Kashkasha as K pronounced Ch, is mainly a feature in the dialects of the tribes of Tamim, Bakr, Asad, Salim, and there were documented wars between Tamim and Bakr. It seems to me that K becoming Sh or Ch through contact between them.
Okay, now I agree with everything he says, except for the part about Shah. And Holes has worked on this before too, and he says that he supposes that Shah is probably from contact with South Arabian languages. Mm. So it started as Kashkasha, yes, but it became Sheen through contact with modern South Arabian languages. This would be really hard to prove, except that he showed, I didn't do it, but I have, if you go to his 2018 article, he's got a map that shows the spread of the infix noon and a map that shows the spread of Sha as opposed to Sha. And you can see that Sha goes all the way up to the borders of the Emirates. And in fact, one of the examples I gave, the first example of infix noon was when he said, Shayfina tal omrich, sorry, he said tal omrish, Kasanat Thanain al-Khamsin. And then Holes also plots on that map the modern South Arabian languages use of Sha. And that actually seems to correspond, at least in southern Arabia, the far south of Arabia, with the pronunciation of the sheen, which I think Ahmed can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's called a shen shena.
So it wouldn't be de-affrication of cha, or cha wouldn't be affrication of sha. It would be two separate, or possibly two separate phenomenons.
Well, the affrication of kaf is actually well attested in a lot of other dialects. And so that probably is just a natural sound change. The sha, we'd really have to examine it much more to see whether it was a de-affrication or further de-affrication of it.
Thank you very much for this. I don't know if you're familiar with this collection of books, which was published in Abu Dhabi. It was Al-Imarat fi Dhakarat Abna'iha. It's in 3 volumes made by Abdullah Abdurrahman, which are also testimonies of old inhabitants of the Emirates and of Abu Dhabi, but unfortunately translated into standard Arabic and not as colloquial Arabic. I wondered if you had any interest of getting in touch with the teams that did this in Abu Dhabi and see if there were any traces, if there were recordings in the first place, traces of recordings, so that such a work that has been conducted in Sharjah might as well have been conducted elsewhere in the Emirates and would provide us with other recordings and other material for dialectologists.
Well, I would be, and I'm also waiting for the National Archives, and maybe these are the same materials, but the United Arab Emirates Archives has 700 recordings. And there's also an organization in Sharjah, I can't remember what it's called now, that has a series of recordings called Treasures of the Northern Emirates. And I'm waiting for these all to become available, and it's been more than a year and they're still not available, but maybe before I retire, I'll be able to get access to them. So yes, I'm always interested in those things. Always
so
interested
I'm sure that
in
there's going to be work for generations and generations of linguists and dialectologists when all those recordings are made available.
And fortunately, we have a younger generation coming up that is looking into Emirati Arabic.
Oh, yes.
And I thank you too. I thank you. It was a delight for me to prepare for the talk because it caused me to go back over the data again and become enthusiastic once again about them.
Thank you. We will meet again next month for a new jalsa, for a new Diwan, Sorbonne and CEFAS, and the talk next month will not be in linguistics and dialectology. The topic will be the city of Dubai from a human geography point of view, from sociology point of view, and it will be with Delphine El Karawi from INALCO. Thank you very much, everybody.